Okay.
It says here, meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
Yeah, we're looks like we're live.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll just give
Yep,
people a second.
it says up there live on Facebook. Here we go.
Here we go. All right, so I'm just opening up a little bit, double checking. So for everybody who's here early, the early birds, we're here with Alex Saviuk with from Marvel and DC Comics, who has his primary work is on Spider-Man. He's been doing that for many years. And we're just here to talk a little bit about his career and what it's like working in the comics industry.
Do you want me to start?
Sure, yeah, you can just go right
okay.
into it.
Well, okay. You know, Ellen just gave me a nice introduction, so I might as well just say that I got into comics in 1977, back in the day when I think it was a lot different to get into the comics at that time, where you could actually send hard copies, Xeroxes of your work to the offices, and they might end up on some big pile on some assistant editor's desk for who knows how long before they finally take, you know, submissions day and decide they're going to start looking through these envelopes. But at any rate, I lived in Long Island, New York, and it was really easy for me to get to New York City, where both Marvel and DC were, you know, their companies were there pretty much within about walking distance of each other anyway. And so if you could set up an appointment, you know, maybe just go upstairs to the reception desk and say, hey, you know, would it be possible for me to get a tour? And they set things up for you. I don't know if they do that anymore now, regardless of the pandemic or not. But so back in the day, I mean, I was going to the School of Visual Arts in New York City, where my teacher mentor was Will Eisner, creator of The Spirit. And I had to do a class project at the end of the first year. And it was a 4-page story that I did with a sort of like a Tarzan type thing, and where Tarzan doesn't survive because he's really cruel and abusive to the apes. And so then at the end of the story, the apes kill him. Okay. So I had this four-page story in my bag, and then I wanted to go ahead and create my own thing. So I did. There was I guess about a 13 or 14-page story called The Sorcerer. And I ended up putting this magazine together. Back in the day, we used to call them fanzines, and publish it myself. And then with that, I was sending out, copies of my fanzine. I printed up 300. So I started sending them out to comic book shops, distributors. At the time, there was this distributor on the East Coast named Phil Suling, who was more or less the father of the modern comic book convention. And he started the big Comic-Cons in New York City. And he might have maybe one a year, and then eventually he might do 2 a year. But around that time, he got in touch with me and said, hey, I really like your book. Can I order 500? And I said, oh, sure, no problem. In the meantime, I knew I didn't have that, but I wasn't going to tell him that. I just went back to the printer and ordered, like, I don't know, 300 more, because I printed up, I think I sold maybe around 75 or 80, or sent them out on my own, sold a bunch. And I think I still have about 150 left in my closet. But at any rate, I gave him the 500. I went to his convention a month later. It was called an Easter Con in New York City in April. And I saw my book on his desk, or tables, I should say. And he might have had about a half a dozen of these tables. And I asked him how it was doing. And he said, yeah, people seem to be, you know, interested in it. Yeah, it's not doing too bad. I said, okay, great. And I went my merry way. And about a half hour later, I get paged back to the table. And there's this little old guy in a shirt and a tie on a Saturday morning, looking through my magazine or a book or a fanzine, whatever you will, with a smile on his face. And so Phil introduced me to Saul Harrison, the then president of DC Comics. And so he's looking through my magazine. He goes, hey, Alex, this is really nice stuff. Are you working? And I said, well, no. He says, hey, how would you like to work for DC Comics? And pretty much that's how I got in. I had to make an appointment to see the art director, which he said was protocol. And so I called up on Monday, got in there on Wednesday, and I left with my first assignment, a one-page mystery story. And that was kind of like, I guess the way DC did, they used to have these books like House of Secrets, House of Mystery, Witching Hour, and certain comics had backups. And so I ended up doing, I guess that one pager. Then they gave me a 7-page science fiction story and a 5-page war story and a 2-page Witching Hour story. And when I brought that last one in, the art director called me into his office and he says, "Hey, how would you like to draw Green Lantern?" And I said, "Really?" He says, "Yeah, we need somebody to do we have a double issue type thing with a Green Lantern story and a Green Arrow story. The then regular artist, Mike Grell, is doing the Green Arrow story. We need somebody for the lead." And so he introduced me to Julius Schwartz, the editor. And Julius just wanted to see a couple of samples of what I had done. So I had to bring those in a couple of days later, showing him how I draw the character. And he handed me my first script done by Denny O'Neil. And that's pretty much how I got into comics. I was there at DC then for about 9 years and drawing everything from Green Lantern for a year and a half. Then I did the Flash for over a half a year. I was the artist at the time that Iris West got killed by the Reverse Flash. So that's my claim to fame as far as the Flash goes, okay? As a matter of fact, they just did a big reprint, hardcover edition of that whole series of stories, which, happened to sell really well. And after that, I got pulled away by some advertising jobs, and I did a movie poster for a adventure fantasy movie called Arabian Adventure. And so I did this, paid a lot of money, and the agent said, "Oh, we got more gigs for you, etc." So I ended up being really busy for a while and got told the editors at DC I got to get out because I got too much work. And then all of a sudden the work stopped. And then bam, so I went crawling back to DC and said, "Hey, you got anything for me?" And they said, "Oh yeah, sure." So I was working back with Julius Schwartz again because at the time he was doing Superman stuff. And so I started with Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane and eventually working my way to doing Superman stories. And also having done, let's say, Aquaman and the Atom and Airwave and Hawkman and World's Finest. So I ran the gamut of doing all their heroes. But then when Superman was selling poorly, the editors let all the people, creative people know on Superman that they were going to basically revamp the storyline. They were going to get new writers, new artists, but that we would all have work. Well, the work lasted another couple of months, and then all of a sudden I turned in my last Superman story, and Julius Schwartz said, "Hey, I don't have anything for you. I got to give my last story to this other artist, Kurt Swan, who was a longtime Superman artist, and go see the freelance coordinator if they have anything for you." They did not. I was lucky enough to have known John Romita and his family, John Romita Sr., because they lived in the town next to mine, and I went to high school with John Romita Sr.'s kids, Victor and John Jr., who is still working at Marvel. So anyway, I went to see John Romita. He was the art director at Marvel. And he said, "Yeah, by all means, drop off whatever you got because we need fill-ins all the time. You can make a living doing fill-ins because our guys are always late." So that was a Tuesday. I dropped the stuff off, and by Thursday, I got a phone call from this editor named Michael Higgins, and he said, "Hey, I hear you're looking for work, and I could use a fill-in on Iron Man." I said, "Okay, great." So I went in to Marvel, and I got this plot to do Iron Man for that one issue. Then after that, I did that successfully, and they gave me covers and other little things to do here and there. And then eventually they needed a fill-in on Spider-Man. And so I did 3 fill-ins on Amazing Spider-Man. The first one of which was the one where on the last page of the book, which was Amazing Spider-Man number 292, Peter proposes to Mary Jane in the airport. And in the last panel with a big smile, she says yes. So I got to draw this really cool thing going on there. And then 2 more fill-ins. And then they needed fill-ins on Web of Spiderman. So I started to do about 4 of those. Actually, I ended up doing 8 of those before I found out that I was the regular artist. And they assumed that I knew, because I didn't find out until I read the letter column in the last one. And they said, oh yeah, our regular art team of Alex and Keith Williams. And I said, I called them up and I said, I find out that I'm the regular guy in the letter column. He goes, well, after all these fill-ins, I assumed you knew. I said, I can't assume. Can't assume anything. So then that basically started my run on Web of Spiderman for about 7.5 years. And then after that, sales were going down, so they wanted to change artists. They gave me another Spider-Man book to do based on the animated series, Adventures of Spider-Man and Spider-Man Adventures. And that lasted about 2.5 years. Then the sales on that went down, and I ended up having to leave Marvel because they had no work for me. But the editor of Spider-Man, Jim Salicrup, had already moved over to Topps Comics, where he was the editor of a lot of licensed stuff like the X-Files, Jurassic Park, etc. And they needed an X-Files artist. So I got to draw the X-Files for 1.5 years doing that. And then basically after that, I just, I didn't get any more comic work for a long time. But I was able to start working on the Sunday Spider-Man newspaper strip with Stan Lee in 1997. And that lasted all of 22 years. And unfortunately, since Stan passed away in November of 2018, actually in another week or so will be the third anniversary. But I mean, he was 95 going on 96, and he was ill. And it was just one of those things. But I'm sure if Stan was still around, I'd still be doing it. Although he wasn't writing it at the time, Roy Thomas, longtime, writer, editor, Roy Thomas had been ghostwriting that strip since the year 2000. So, Roy and I would always be ready to, come back, because King Features Syndicate that carries the strip said, it's not dead yet. It's just got to go through some legal stuff, and that could take forever. So I told him I'm not losing any sleep, but we're ready if you need us. So in the meantime, besides that, I occasionally draw a comic book for a Swedish company for the character called the Phantom, who debuted in the newspapers back in 1936. The Phantom is extremely popular in Norway, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, India, Europe, all over the place. So I do 1, maybe 2 books a year that I pencil and ink just to keep my hand at it. But in the meantime, I'm also working on a Kickstarter project called The Masters, which is it's a 164-page story spanning 5 issues. And the editor, publisher of it is, he collected, a couple of dozen of all of us Bronze Age artists. So you've got all these really great people that you don't see in comics today, but we used to be the #1 guys back in the day. So, if you're interested, it's called The Masters. It's on Kickstarter. It's really cool. I mean, I'm working on a 17-page story with inker Al Milgram. Alan Weiss came out of retirement. He did a story for them. Joe Rubenstein is inking a bunch of stuff. I'm trying to think who else is on there, but yeah, there's just a ton of guys doing stuff. Let's see, even Butch Geis is doing a cover. Tom Morgan is doing a poster. Whoever he can get to do something for this thing just to help promote it and make it look great, plain and simple. So, but that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Well, that's an amazing story, honestly. It's so cool how you basically were just a self-starter. Like, you made your own comic and you just put it out there to see what would happen. And it worked out really well for you.
Yeah, nowadays, with the advent of course, of the internet, comics are global. Back in my days, I mean, I think maybe 5 years before I got in, or 6 years, DC went to the Philippines. And because they saw the Filipino artists were so good that they kind of lured them over to DC Comics. And in the Philippines, these guys were great, and they had to draw pencil and ink 3 pages a day just to make a living. Where you can come to America, if you did 3 pages a day of pencils and inks, even though the rates weren't that great, you could really make an unbelievable living doing 15 pages of pencils and inks, or maybe even a book a week. You'd get, technically you'd be rich, especially for the rates of the day. But now you've got the internet, and if you look at this magazine called Previews, which I'm sure all the fans are aware of as to what's coming out every month, I mean, it's global. You got artists from all over the world, you know, from China, from Indonesia, from Turkey, and some of the names are difficult to pronounce, but these guys are very young and they're unbelievably good. So the competition is really fierce, fiercer now than it ever was to get into comics. So I think one of the questions we had sort of talked about earlier was, hey, what advice could I give to an aspiring artist? I would say, number one, as always, I would tell them, you have to be able to draw everything at the drop of a hat. And if you can't draw it at the drop of a hat, we have the internet, where there's no excuse not to look up some reference for a car, a vehicle, a plane, anything like that, where you're going to draw some funky looking thing off the top of your head, because cars are not rectangular boxes. They're rounded, they're curvy, they're all this stuff. You got to get photo reference. With the computer, you can grab it, copy it, put it down, trace it, pop it into your panel. Buildings, you got to, when you look at a building, don't think of a building as a big box. Just like all people are different, every building is different. You look at the skyline in New York City and the windows are different, the heights are different, the shapes are different. They all have a certain personality of their own. You have to be able to draw that to be convincing. And you have to be a great storyteller. You can't just draw pretty pictures. I'm not going to go ahead and throw any of my colleagues under the bus, because some of them aren't necessarily my colleagues because I don't know them. But I see evidence that there are some of the new artists that do come in that the storytelling isn't exactly the number one priority. You can't just go about having a lot of pretty pictures with word balloons where you have to read everything while the guy's standing there for 5 pages looking at each other and talking. That's not good comics, okay, in my opinion. All right, somebody else might, differ from that, because they'll say, well, times changed. That was my time, this is this time. But storytelling should still be a premium when it comes to telling a comic book story in this two-dimensional medium that we have. It's not a video game, it's a comic book.
I think you're totally right. It's so much more interesting when there's actually it's like cinematography, but it's for the page. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen comic books where for pages, on a couple of 3 pages, we haven't even seen an establishing shot yet. We have no idea where we are. And that was one of the things that was key to storytelling when I first got in, was that, hey, somewhere in that first page, doesn't have to be the first panel, but somewhere right there near the top, we should have an establishing shot as to where we are, whether it's outside the building, in the city, and even writing. If somebody is walking down the street named Ed, that first caption shouldn't say, while Ed was walking down the street. We know he's walking down the street. We see it, okay? The dialogue should be there to enhance the panel, not explain what's in the panel, because otherwise, why do we need the panel? So, yeah, establishing shots. If you're in a room, design the room so that even while you're telling a story, if you look at movies and TV shows, I mean, the room has been put together by a production designer. There are, let's say, there could be a desk. On the desk are lamps, statuettes, Rolodexes, whatever, phones, intercoms, whatever props are in the room. There could be a plant in the corner. There could be some sort of like a standing lamp. Now, all these things can be effective in storytelling because, as your camera, instead of just being boring on 2 heads, you can pull back and you can pull past what's on the desk. Okay, and you can move your camera around, see what's on the ceiling. Is it a fluorescent light or is it a ceiling fan? There's all these things, all these opportunities that you have to be able to set up that picture compositionally and make it more interesting. I remember when I was doing the X-Files, there was a lot of back and forth with conversation between the 2 main characters, Mulder and Scully. And I'd have a script where in 2 pages, let's say, they'll be sitting at a diner, okay, having coffee and some conversation. And the writer left it up to me. He would say, you know, panel one, a shot of the diner, establishing shot of the diner. So you got your diner from the outside. Then on the panel two, it doesn't say establishing shot inside. I mean, I know I got to go inside and show you what the diner looks like. So that it could be, you know, them sitting in a booth, you know, showing Mulder, showing Scully, showing the waitress coming by with a tray of food or whatever, showing usually there's a counter where somebody's drinking coffee or falling asleep on the counter or whatever. Silhouettes of them, just let's say in profile, close-ups, back and forth, long shots, looking in through the window at the two of them sitting there. There were 10, I think there were 8 panels. And in those 8 panels, I kind of covered the gamut of everything that I'm talking about, so that each panel was interesting enough to want to make you continue reading it, and just instead of seeing, you know, close-ups back and forth, you know, in a window pane because they're sitting next to the window. I mean, this old diner had, you know, I don't know if you've ever been in any of these old diners, but they, on the, let's say the table near the window, they would have these boxes where you could push buttons to play songs, like a little mini jukebox, right? And so, you know, even though they weren't pushing the button because it didn't say that they were going to be listening to music, but you draw it and it's there, you know, the sugar dispenser and the little tray where you have salt and pepper and ketchup. And I mean, all these things, then if you're drawing the inside of the diner, you make it believable, because I'm sure everybody's been inside a diner. Behind the counter, you've got, you know, cakes underneath glass. You've got the coffee making machine where they dispense the coffee and all this kind of stuff. And anything that you can put into that environment to make it that much more convincing and believable, hey, that's a plus in your column.
Yeah, exactly. It's about all the details.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I'm sure you've seen a movie where in the opening credits, they're panning from frame to frame, and you see all these things that are giving you the feel of the time period. Okay, you might never see that shot again in the movie, but you already have the feel of the movie. I mean, if it's a 1950s movie and you see those old telephones and any of these old little things, you know, the blinds, the this, the that, whatever is in the room, and you kind of feel like, oh yeah, this looks like it's in the 50s. And it is, okay? And then as time goes on, I storyboarded a movie called Lonely Hearts that was set in the late 40s and early 50s. And it's a detective story. It starred John Travolta and James Gandolfini. And here in Florida, in Jacksonville ended up doubling for Mineola, Long Island, New York, where the main action took place, okay? And these prop guys would go out and they'd have to find all these things from that time period that they can dress up a police station or somebody's apartment or the guy's desk, whatever. Anything that looks out of the ordinary would just stick out like a sore thumb. So they just like go authentic crazy. They gotta, you know, get all this stuff together that makes it look like the 50s time period. And I believe, I'm trying to remember what channel, one of the streaming channels, I think it might be Prime, has Lonely Hearts on it right now if you want to check it out. And look at the end credits because it says storyboards by Alex Saviuk. Okay, so that's kind of neat.
I mean, that's got to be awesome to see your name in the credits of a movie. That's got to be a great feeling.
Yeah, I know. It's like, you know, the guys at Marvel now, when the movies say, and special thanks to, and they got 3 lines as the things are scrolling and you're like, okay, I gotta catch that. So if you watch it on TV, you can just pause it so you can read everybody's name, right? In the theaters, you can't do that. But there's so many people that they're thanking. But, you know, yeah, that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Because I know, like, and they like to like have fun with it when it's the establishing of the. Because it makes me think of the Captain Marvel movie.
Yes.
They're like, look, how are we going to show her the '90s? She's going to fall into a blockbuster.
Yes, right. Well, and the thing is that because they kind of try to set it into a not too distant past. I mean, when Captain Marvel first came out in the 40s, there was no blockbuster. So by doing blockbuster now, something of the past, it gives you a sense of a particular time period. But they have to be careful when they do that because they, you know, if you're going to do a blockbuster, which is, they pretty much don't exist anymore, then you can't have, if the movie is, if the movie comes out, in 2020, you can't have a 2020 car driving past and they're dropping into a blockbuster. Because that whole business is defunct. I don't think there's any of them left. And if they were even there, they probably tore them down by now and turned it into something else.
Exactly, you're right. Because to bring it back to Spider-Man a little bit, in comparison, he's in a high school in modern time, and so they've got to have completely different details. Even though some shots might not look a lot different, they are, because they have to pay attention to, like you said, the cars and the phones and everything.
Yeah, and even the fashion.
Smartphone out in the 90s.
Right. And if now with Tom Holland doing Spider-Man, it's set in the modern world. Okay, so yeah, you're going to have your smartphones, you're going to have whatever. The fashions are what they are. Kids are dressing the way kids dress now. Even if I was to draw a comic book now, I'd have to be a lot more fashion conscious if I was doing, people in their late teens, early 20s. Especially, what everybody's wearing. Hairstyles, the whole thing. You got to stay up with the times. And even though it's the type of thing where that becomes the norm, if you're doing the norm, nobody's really noticing it because it's the norm. But if you do something out of the norm, they go, oh, wow, that kid looks like a real geek. He's still got hair from the 70s and parted in the middle and it's down to the shoulders. What does he think he is, like a rocker or something? And I'm not saying that there aren't people like that out there, but that's definitely not the norm.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So one thing you talked about when you were talking about your career I thought was really interesting. You said the first thing you did was a one-page mystery.
Yes.
I'd love to hear a little bit about that because that seems like a really tough challenge to write a whole mystery in one page.
Well, I think it started off where this crook was sort of skulking around in an alleyway in panel 1. It was 6 panels. And then in panel 2, he hears something and he whips his head behind him. And in panel 3, he's looking up and there seems to be this bright light coming down and it turns to be some sort of an angel. Okay. And he's like, oh no, wait, this guy's skulking around and it turns out that he's a werewolf because there's some unsuspecting guy and then he jumps and bites him in the neck. And then after that, he sees the light. And then when the angel comes down, I guess the light of the angel just like, vampire, because the light ended up, burning the guy up into flames and all this kind of stuff. So it was just like a quickie little one scene. Okay, where in the last panel, the angels get all glowing, typical angel, white robe, blonde hair, wings, light shining, and in the foreground, this guy was laying there, his hadn't burst into flames or anything, but his, he looked like he was half skull, half face, and it definitely got destroyed. So, and you get a script. At DC, it was always full script. So they give you the art direction, they give you the dialogue. I don't think there really was dialogue. I think it was just captions. And so you have to kind of lay out the captions, get all that in there, and then you have the rest of the panel to draw. So that was my first thing. And it's odd because I don't think that one-page story, the 7-page science fiction story I drew secondly, actually came out before the one-page story came out in House of Mystery, I think number 50. And then the science fiction story, I forget what book that came out. It might have been House of Secrets or something like that. I don't think they had a science fiction story book going on at that time. And if they Strange Adventures, maybe, I don't know. It was in one of those. But that was the one and only time that I actually got to work with Bob Layton. And we became friends after that. And pretty much to this day, although we're kind of like in touch, not in touch, when you drift apart and stuff like that. But it was because he liked working on my pencils because he said they reminded him of Gil Kane. As a matter of fact, I didn't leave something out. When I first got into the Green Lantern thing, what happened was the art director, who was Vince Colletta at the time, when he introduced me to Julia Schwartz, he says, hey, this is Alex, the guy I told you about. He draws better than Gil Kane. And I said, oh, no, that's, I said, no, hey, that's, you're getting way ahead of yourself. I'm not claiming that I can do that. And, and Julius Schwartz said to me, yeah, what makes you think you can draw Green Lantern? And I said, well, I'm a big fan of Gil Kane. I love the character. And he goes, yeah, that's when he said, well, let me see how you approach him and send me those samples. So yeah, that's pretty much how I got that gig. That was pretty funny. But yeah, and the thing is that I kind of drew like Gil Kane, not because I looked at a lot of Gil Kane, but because I'm more or less self-taught. And there was I would say for anatomy and figure drawing, there's a book out there that I would say every young aspiring artist should pick up. And it was out of print for a while, but now with the internet, I think you can download it, or you might even still be able to get it in certain bookstores. And the book is called Figure Drawing for All It's Worth. And it's by a author named Andrew Loomis, Loomis. And if you don't believe me, and I always tell that to the kids that I recommend this to, and I say, listen, Alex Ross, the famous artist / painter that's been, wowing us for all these years at DC Comics, that's his Bible, okay? If you look at the way Alex Ross draws, he, I'm not saying he's lifting, but he's taking his cues from that Andrew Loomis book. It's a great book because it simplifies anatomy, shows you how to go about creating figures, doesn't overload you with, every single muscle in the body that, if you pick up a book that says Handbook of Anatomy for Students, and you look in there and you go, oh gosh, I got to memorize all these muscles. Now, some artists do that. They've memorized all those muscles and they like to draw them because they have memorized them, but then it looks like they're wearing painted costumes. They're not, there's too much stuff going on there. In Andrew Loomis's book, he gives you muscle groups that will show up if you're still wearing a tight enough, spandex costume or whatever. And then again, when I was talking about the Phantom, back in those days when the Phantom was around in the newspapers and you had Flash Gordon and some of these other heroes, these guys had great builds. I mean, their shoulders were super wide. They had, maybe a 32, 33-inch waist. And they wore these, shirts that show the outline of their shoulders, maybe a bicep or something, but they didn't go crazy with all the muscles because you're talking about material, okay? If it's not going to be, let's say, the type of material that a woman, has for her stockings, where you can see everything, and I doubt that they do, and even when you look at the movies now, hey, these guys are wearing some of them wear fairly tight outfits, but you're not seeing every single muscle outlined and rendered the way they try to do in comics. If you want to draw that way, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too. There are certain artists that don't put every muscle group in that are incredibly popular, and then there's those that prefer to do it that way. And as long as the editors hire them, well, that's cool.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I know exactly what you're talking about with the every single muscle. It looks like they're wearing paint.
Oh yeah, and then when you look at the female heroes are all 38, 22, 36. Okay, and even in those 38s, they all have the same shapes. So after a while, it's like, okay, well, I guess if there was a flat-chested superheroine, people will go, oh man, she's flat-chested, what gives? Well, everybody else is, looking like they should be posing in Playboy, but hey, it is what it is. And you see some of these costumes that these guys design for the heroines, and you go, wow, if you actually saw that on the screen, the parents will go, I'm not letting my kid go see that movie. It would be crazy. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So everybody who's out there right now, we're going to open it up to questions. If you have a question for Alex, just write it in the comments, and we're going to keep going. And so we'll be taking those. So
Also, I'd like to say that if there's anybody out there who would be interested in, I'm not going to be doing any live drawing now, but if anybody's interested in commissions, sketches, etc., I have some examples here of the type of things of the work I do. So, for example, this is a Mary Jane. It's called a half a body. And, you can usually do it on 9x12 or 11x14. I have also, here's a gambit. This was done on 9x12. Okay. And, if you're interested, we can talk prices. I also do full figures. And also I've got some exclusive comics here where I did covers. This is a Vampirella, okay, that came out. It's, as you can see here, it's signed by Nathan Zerdy, who was the color artist renderer. And I signed the bottom because I did the black and white line art. And so I've got those for sale. I also have a Red Sonja that we did together. He signed it in red on the side. I signed it in silver on the bottom. And I will sell these. And if you're inquiring about it, and also do remarks on them, because that seems to be a really popular thing in conventions now. People come to me with comics and say, hey, can you do a remark on here? Fine. I mean, half the time I don't even have to feel like I don't have to bring pads to the conventions anymore to do sketches, because people are bringing me blank sketch covers. And that's a really popular thing. I don't have sketch covers. If you're interested in a commission and we can chat, you can go on my website, which is just alexsaviuk.com, one word, and you can inquire about a commission there, and it goes straight to my email, and we can talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that is a really amazing opportunity to get a commission from someone as experienced and talented as you. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah. So while we're waiting to see if people want to engage, I had a question actually that I really want to know is, what would you say is the difference between working, since you work with Marvel and DC, what's kind of the difference between working for them?
Well, at the time, now I think it's pretty much the same between the two companies, because at the time that I worked at DC, everything was full script. I would get, each page would be, if it was a 20-page story, I got 20 pages of script. There would be panels 1 through 5 or 6, depending upon how the writer was writing the story. Each panel would be headed by an art direction as to what happens in the panel. And then you'd get the word balloons outlined. So if it was Green Lantern talking to Green Arrow, it would say panel 1, Green Lantern and Green Arrow are standing in the cemetery, by the grave of their friend. And then there would be 2, then it would say GL for Green Lantern, and he would have a line, then GA would have a line, and then panel 2, close-up of Green Lantern. So then that's what you draw. At Marvel, when I got there, they were still working in the so-called Stan Lee / Marvel style, where Stan Lee had invented this way of working with artists / storytellers. Not that, as a script, as following a script, you still have to be able to tell the story to make things move and be consistent from panel 1 to panel 2. But the Marvel way is somebody gives you, let's say, a big paragraph for page 1, like I had described to you, and page 1 will say Green Lantern and Green Arrow are at the cemetery. They're talking about this, that, and whatever. It's, at times Green Lantern's getting very passionate. Green Arrow is just scoffing at him and starts walking away, etc. Now, I would have to take that and break that down into panels, however many panels I see fit to be able to deal with that, okay? Without necessarily, I don't have the dialogue, but I have to make sure that in whatever panel I draw, I'm leaving the writer room to put the dialogue in afterwards, okay? So that was so in working the plot style, certain writers would give me, let's say, page 1, Spider-Man is swinging over the city. That's page 1. And that could be an art direction any place. But in a plot style, they might be giving me ideas of like what they're going through, because page 2, he's still swinging, Spider-Man's still swinging to end up at the end of page 3 to get to land on the Daily Bugle and turn into Peter Parker. So now, while he's giving me dialogue hints, and as he's swinging past certain landmarks, so I can pick the landmarks heading towards the Bugle, I can do a big giant hero panel shot as he's with the action, and then draw 3 little panels next to it. As long as I'm moving the story along and giving him room to write, then, if I think of something else that, it would be cool if maybe we show a panel where he's swinging small in the air and people are down below and they're pointing at him, but he could still be thinking, going through that particular thought process as he's going from one panel to the next. So again, I'm trying to create interest and make a sense, have a feeling of variety from panel to panel, other than just seeing him swinging or close-ups of his eyes or whatever. So that's the difference between DC and Marvel at the time. Now, from what I understand, both companies are full script.
That's really cool, though. Do you prefer one over the other? Do you prefer having?
Well, initially, when the transition from doing full script to plot was, I was taking every line that the writer wrote literally, and I would end up with 10 and 11 page panel pages, because I felt obligated to do everything that they were writing. But at the same time, in talking to the editors, then they said, well, no, you can combine what they're writing into panels, just as long as they'll be able to figure out how to move the dialogue, etc. So once I get past that initial transition, I preferred working the Marvel style, because it just gave me so much freedom of composition and how I wanted to design the page, so that sometimes, like, for example, there's this one writer named Howard Mackey, who I had a great time with, and we would always, somehow, whenever he would plot something, there was always room for me to think, okay, this is going to be the end of the page, and it's going to be the page turner. Okay, so now at that end, at that last panel, you want to go, okay, what happens next? And we could actually change scenes at that point and go somewhere else for 2 pages. And then at the end of that, you want to turn the page again, and now you're back to the other scene to see what happened. Kind of like the way some writers write. But I thought that was kind of a neat way of doing things, and I really enjoyed that.
That sounds really fun. And yeah, I'm familiar with Howard Mackey, so that's awesome that you got to work with him.
Oh, yeah, we did Spider-Man together. Well, let's see. We actually did, his first writing assignment was that Iron Man fill-in that I did back in 1986. And then after that, he was the one actually that recommended me to Jim Salicrup, the editor, to do the Spider-Man fill-ins. And Howard also, I think he was the editor on a Captain America special project that I did. So we've kind of worked together whenever we could. But we did, let's see, Spider-Man, Web of Spiderman, I think from number 84 through 89 was a fantastic storyline called The Name of the Rose, which was Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, actually had a son who was going to replace him as the Kingpin. And so that was a cool, 6-issue thing. And then we also did the 30th anniversary of Spider-Man issue, Web of Spiderman, which was a double-sized thing. And it was based on, Mysterio. And there was a lot of really fantastic imagery going on in there. And again, working with a plot, case in point, in terms of working with a plot, the first page of that story in Web 90 took place in an agent's office. This agent was, I think, eventually going to get Peter Parker to do movies or something like that. But in his office, it says he's sitting behind his desk and he's faced with tons of Spider-Man memorabilia. So he's already worked with Spider-Man. And to make that, and now it says, oh, he's got, little statues, he's got posters, he's got, all these little stuff of Spider-Man. There's even a statue, a life-size statue in his office. And so what I keyed off on, it was the life-size statue on the first page, because my camera was behind, 3/4 behind Spider-Man, with his hand kind of reaching forward, and you don't know it's a statue. Okay, so he's sitting at his desk, just kind of casually smoking a cigar, and Spider-Man is lurking in the foreground like he's stalking him, and you're going, oh, what happens next? And then on the second page, now I pull back and I show the entire office pretty much with that life-size figure about, 7 or 8 feet in front of his desk off to the side, in the same pose, obviously, so that you can see, oh, wow, it was a statue. So, when you're doing certain things like in a plot, if the writer doesn't give you those clues, that becomes the part of the storyteller to make it interesting, to make it fun, to keep moving things along.
I love that. And I love talking about like the camera, like you're saying, because it is, you have to have that idea of where the viewer is. And it really is similar to a camera, which is why I think it worked so well when Marvel decided to start doing the comic book movies, like with that serious budget behind them. Because it was
Right.
already kind of like that.
Oh, yeah. And the one thing about the camera, because you're actually in doing comics, it really helped me a lot in doing storyboards when I did it. I think I did about 4 or 5 films. I did a lot of TV commercials. And, when you look at when you do let's say you're storyboarding a car commercial, and if you're watching that commercial and, the car is coming at you, then it's up from behind. And you could, if you paused your television, and if you saw that there were 25 different looks on that car, each one of those has to be a storyboard panel, because whether 9 times out of 10, sometimes you work with a director where he'll give you a shot list and he'll say, okay, and he'll describe those shots that you see on television in the commercial, because he says low angle car coming at me, high angle view, major road, car from behind zooming away, and you have to kind of translate his words to pictures, which is the same thing as doing comics, to an extent. So that was always my plan B, was, well, I wanted to do comics, but I also like to do advertising. Eventually, I got the break to do some movies. And going back to what we were talking about earlier about aspiring comic book artists, one of the things I would say to anybody who wants to get into comics, because some people go, hey, what do I need to do to get into comics? Well, sure, all the things I had described earlier, but you need to be able to fall back on something else like advertising, storyboards. Now video games are very popular. Video games need story artists all the time. They probably pay a heck of a lot more than comic books would, even at this point. And there's guys that do video games that go, hey, I've been doing video game storyboards for ages. Man, I want to get into comics. Well, you can, because you're a storyteller. And if your style is appropriate for what the editors are looking for, then you'll get into comics. But you should have leave yourself those avenues to look into, besides just thinking that you're going to do comics for the rest of your life, because I doubt if that would happen.
And that's really great advice, I think. So we only have a few minutes left, but I would love to ask, so Spider-Man No Way Home is coming out soon, which is the next movie.
Right.
So do you have any thoughts, like as somebody who's worked with the character of Spider-Man for decades, like do you like where they're going? Do you like what how they're using him in the MCU?
Well, to be honest with you, I just it's funny how Hollywood decides to change characterizations. Okay, let's say, for example, I saw Tobey Maguire and he was okay as Peter Parker. I wasn't crazy about Kirsten Dunst being Mary Jane. Mary Jane was supposed to, she had kind of a horrible past. Her father was abusive, etc. So she always masked, that anguish by being upbeat, snapping her fingers, wanting to dance around. And Kirsten Dunst just seemed to be too whiny. That was my impression, okay? The second wave with Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker. I liked Andrew Garfield, but somehow Peter didn't seem like he was that nerdy and that geeky anymore. He seemed a little bit too cool, but I loved Emma Stone. Emma was Gwen. She could have been Mary Jane if she wanted to, because she's got reddish hair anyway. She was fantastic. She was the best thing of that, and they had a pretty good chemistry, I thought, between them. And now that when Tom Holland came in and you first saw him in the Avengers movie, and he was just like, cracking jokes and stuff. And initially I said, what is wrong with this guy? And then I thought back, that's what Stan Lee had created back in the day when Spider-Man was wearing his costume and he was beating up on the bad guys. He was always wisecracking and talking, whatever. It was never a quiet fight. And so they were trying to keep that persona going with Tom Holland. However, then when you've got certain characterizations like, well, let's see, Flash Thompson was a football jock, but now he's like a brainy guy in the classroom, in the science. I'm going, he's in science, Flash Thompson, no freaking way, you know? And, you know, Zendaya, as much as she's a great actress and a beautiful girl, they downplayed her to make her look so like stripped down as Mary Jane. And somehow she just, and again, she did not fit the persona for me. Okay. And, you know, to have Michael Keaton end up becoming, let's say, the Vulture somehow didn't seem to carry over for me. And of course, they make that connection where, let's see, his Liz Allen, right? They got Liz Allen, and that's his, you know, he's got interests in Liz Allen. And then when he's taking her to the prom, they go to the house, and wow, bing, the dad answers, and he happens to be the Vulture guy. Okay. So they, you know, they like to mix this stuff around with the personalities and stuff. That's kind of off-putting, being familiar with these characters for such a long time. But you know, if the movie is still entertaining, it doesn't really bother me. You know, I'm there to watch a movie and have a good time. I'm not really there to dissect the whole thing. Like some people say, oh, you're gonna hate it if you're into this, that, and the other thing. I'm out there to be entertained. You know, they do a great job with, you know, the visuals and all that stuff. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Well, I really love hearing your thoughts on that, because I definitely agree. Like it's with the movies, they always want to do their own thing. So it's interesting to see how, because the comics already had, you know, really different runs, and each new
Right.
storyteller brought their own kind of flavor to the character. But the movies have really decided to kind of have fun changing things around.
Right. And the costumes in the movies in the last decade, ever since Iron Man showed up, have been really, really cool. I mean, if you look at an old Iron Man comic, I mean, his Iron Man suit was rather bland. So they really jacked it up by the time, even his initial armor, the gray one, you know, when he was putting that together in the cave, and then they were playing rock music as he was coming out, you know, that was really cool. And then the actual Iron Man armor, you know, has just evolved, and there's just so much to it. I wouldn't want to be filling in on an Iron Man comic anymore, because it's just too much stuff to draw in each panel. It gets crazy. And then initially looking at Captain America, you go, oh, he's got leather straps and this and that, but somehow it dresses it up. It's more practical looking. They don't really go for the garish colors, you know, like the reds are subdued, the blues are subdued. They didn't put the little wings on his helmet, but they painted them on, which looked kind of neat. So you still had that flavor of it. And it's funny because in that first Captain America movie, when Chris Evans is working for the government USO, and he comes out and he's in that, let's say, ordinary type of Captain America costume, and you go, well, that looks kind of weird, because it just somehow didn't fit. Whereas, you know, the Captain America outfit that he ended up having with the chin strap and whatever, and there's Captain America with a gun. I mean, all that stuff was really cool. So yeah, I really like what they've done with the characters in the movies. Although in the last Avengers, the Hulk should have just been the Hulk, and he shouldn't have been half Banner, half Hulk, because he really was kind of ineffective. It's almost like, well, if we have too much Hulk, he's going to beat the heck out of everybody, and then we won't be able to continue the story. But you know, in that initial part where he wants to get angry, but he can't get angry, and I'm thinking, you know, you're killing us over here. We need the Hulk. So whatever, you know.
I totally get what you're saying. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're just about wrapped up. So
no questions from anybody in the feed.
Yeah, it looks like we didn't have a lot of engagement, which is okay. Sometimes people feel shy, you know. I know the virtual format's always a little different than the live format. But so everybody who is watching, don't forget that Alex has the Masters Kickstarter going on, and you can check that out. And it sounds like it's an amazing collection of Bronze Age artists and everything. I'm definitely going to go look at that the second this is over, because it sounds really cool. And that he also has his commission info open on his site, which is alexsaviuk.com, all one word. And that is an opportunity you just don't get very often, to get personal work done by someone as talented as this. So definitely go check him out. And thank you so much again for joining us. This has been amazing.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. Okay.
And don't forget to check our next panel with him, which will be next week. So we'll be putting the post up about that very soon. Thank you guys so much.
Okay, bye-bye now.